is Ava Weller, and I'm the immediate past president of the Jewish Historical Society. I'm filling in for Alyssa Kaplan, who is away today. On behalf of the Jewish Historical Society, I just want to thank all of you. Without you, the people in this room, we couldn't do the good work that we do. And all of you are important to us, and I just want to thank you for being here, for coming and supporting the Jewish Historical Society. Professor John Barrett will share a few insights now, a little special presentation for those of you who are here. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and it's really a pleasure and honor to be here with you. I'll be talking on the other side of the curtain about the Nuremberg trials following World War II and their contemporary significance. The reason I'm able to do that is because I've had the good fortune to be taught by teachers who had materials that allowed them to educate. And what you do as supporters of a historical society is enable all of that. So I'm a beneficiary of your generosity, your commitment, your vision, and I'm just a token representative of millions, I mean really millions, down through generations that we're never going to know, that benefit from what educators do. So really what I wanted to do is just thank you. I'm not from Connecticut, I'm from New York City, I teach at St. John's, I live in Manhattan, but you know, quick Sunday morning zip up the Hutchinson and here I am. And it's a very impressive community commitment through Ava, her colleagues, the Historical Society, all of you as interested people and supporters, to spend your time on things that matter. And frankly, to spend your resources on things that matter. It's easy to chicken out, or to get fatigued, or to get distracted, or to kind of bunker in selfish pursuits. And we all succumb to that in spots. You know, there's no sainthood, at least certainly not me, and I would bet not too many of you. But there is high achievement and high commitment, and that for me isn't just you in this venture, although again I applaud it. It connects back to the things that bring us here. It connects back to the Manns, who I've only gotten to know through videotape, but we're obviously wonderful, outward-directed, community-building, philanthropic, voluntary service spirits. It connects back to World War II service and occupation army service. It connects back to something like the Nuremberg trials, which we think of as a huge, big project, and they were, but really were lots of people doing their small corner of something outward-directed, rather than folding up, bunkering in, being selfish, not giving it their best. So I'm delighted to be ex officio now connected to your historical society and to be here with you this morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Ava Weller, and I'm the immediate past president of the Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County. It's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Society and President Alyssa Kaplan, who could not be with us today. Today we look forward to the first named lecture of our Society, the Norma and Milton Mann Lecture. I would like to thank the Tao Foundation for underwriting today's lecture on behalf of Camille Kramer, who is a dear friend of mine and has been a friend of the Society for many years. Camille, you can stand. Thank you, Camille. It is also my privilege for me and my family to join the Foundation in underwriting the lecture. The topic has significance for me as it has for the Mann family. Some of you may not know that my father is a Holocaust survivor, and we would hope that the legacy of the Nuremberg trials would have made the world more just. Much of my family's history has been lost, but thanks to the foresight of the founders of the JHS, the Jewish community's history in Fairfield County is being preserved. JHS maintains the only Jewish archives in Fairfield County, which is located in Stamford. It holds an extraordinary photography collection with more than 2,000 photos, as well as artifacts and memorabilia. We collect stories and memories about local history through our Oral History Project, now extended to include a new theme of Jewish politicians and movers and shakers. Our Veterans History Project is part of the National Archives Folklife program. How many of you here today are members of the Jewish Historical Society? Great. So that means that many of you are not. So we welcome you to be with us today for this very special program. Some of you may not know that the JHS maintains a free lending library open to all that is located at Stanford JCC with a wide selection of books and DVDs on Jewish topics for all ages. The library also houses an extensive Holocaust collections of books and research materials for those who are interested in today's topic. JHS also holds monthly programs and book talks, and will be offering a new genealogy research workshop series this summer. Please take a look at the back of the handout for more details. I know not everyone got them, but we will be having a program on June 28th at the main Ferguson Library. JHS will present a new program on local history in conjunction with Stanford's 375th anniversary. Our exciting fall program on September 24th, Solving the Mystery, How to Track Down and Recover Art Stolen from the Nazis, will feature by the Nazis, oops. Two active art hunters will share their stories at the Bruce Museum in Greenwich at 10:30. Programs are free and open to the community. At this time, I would like to invite our board members to stand. So you can see our board, our hardworking board, and every board member here helped us put this program on today. So I want to thank you all for your help in making today possible. And I know there are others who've helped who are not board members. If you'd like to stand as well or raise your hand, we thank you very much for supporting us. We can't go on without a special thanks to Marcy Schoenfeld, because she not only is a VP of programming, but she has managed all the food today. And so we want to thank Marcy for her contribution. Please also don't leave today without taking a look at the exhibits. We have some wonderful photographs of the Mann family and a lovely display about Nuremberg. It will really pull some things together, and we want to thank Carmit and Zisman and others. Deborah, I shouldn't be doing this because I know I'll forget someone, but for putting together a display. It's really quite lovely. Today is a special day for the Jewish Historical Society because today we are presenting the inaugural Norma and Milton Mann lecture, named for an extraordinary couple who were most generous with their time and talents over decades. Longtime board members of JHS, they were individually and together leaders in the Stanford community and beyond, making significant contributions that left a legacy of true service and accomplishment. We are fortunate to have their daughters with us today. While no longer living in Stanford, they came here to be with us. And Pamela and Madeline, would you like to come up and say a few words?
Okay. Thank you. So I'm Pamela, this is Madeline, and we just want to say good morning to all of you and express our gratitude for taking the time to honor our parents, Milton and Norma. We know them, they're dear in our hearts, but we are always so touched when we learn that they have touched so many more people within this community. So thank you for the honor. They spoke very highly about their involvement not only in the Jewish community, but also the Jewish Historic Society, and we're very touched that you've committed this lecture in their honor. A special thank you to the board and Ava Weller. We thank you for taking the time to reach out to us and say, we want to come up with a lecture to honor your parents. Can you help me brainstorm about a topic? So that's a nice little segue to say that when we were closing up my parents' house after Dad passed away, we found things that we didn't even know about. So Dad had certainly talked about his time in the service, and one thing that stood up was his involvement or the opportunity to participate as an observer at the Nuremberg trials. He just in passing had said, and you'll see in the Jewish historical tape, that he said, I attended it, but he also said it really influenced his life. So when we were packing up the house, we found some old photos of his time in the service, which unfortunately we hadn't seen while he was alive. And as Madeline will talk more about, a whole pouch of letters that he had written to his friends and his family that were saved. So that's the topic. So thank you.
Thank you. So to continue where Pamela left off, as she said, the connection to the Nuremberg trials really came from going through their houses and their drawers and coming upon this. And we sat at the kitchen table and read these letters. I don't even know who put this together, but it was saved and it's an archive, and it just means all these places and stories and carrying on the stories. It's so important to pass them on. I wish we had known more before Dad had passed on. There's so many questions I'd love to ask him. So I wanted to read a piece of one of the letters, which will connect us with what our lecture is today. Hi, Bill, and this was to a dear childhood friend. It's been a long time since I've heard from you, so here's another letter to push your pen along. I have a funny feeling that both of us are living through enough things to tell our children about for the rest of their lives. And he wrote this as an 18, 19-year-old, which is just amazing to sit here as his adult children and think he was going to tell us these stories as a young man, and we miss them. Practically every day turns up something new or different. And I think how germane to what's happening right now. I'm still working as I&E with the new little of assistant questions added on. I don't even know what that says. I got that other stripe so that I'm T4 now. The rank doesn't mean too much, but those extra dollars always help. The only gripe I've got about my job is a colonel now, my boss, and he is as chicken as they come. The captain that was in charge is assisted to the colonel, and he's trying to take care of his boys. As I told you before, I take care of schools, among other things, and along that line, I got a quota to send a few men to visit the Nuremberg war crime trials. Naturally, yours truly went, and he got within spitting distance of all those big boys, including Göring, Hess, Ribbentrop, and 18 other bastards. So he was there, and if we can learn more and carry on the story, how incredible. And in closing, I'm going to add a birthday note that my grandmother sent to Dad when he was in training at Norwich in Vermont. And she wrote, I hope by your next birthday we shall celebrate it in peacetime. Meanwhile, be well and get strong. And let finding peace be a lesson that we learn from the trials. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for bringing your treasures, and it brings to mind that there may be other treasures out there in your own attics or basements, and please look for them because they they can be heirlooms for the future. So for this particular topic, it ties personal history and global history together. Our goal was to bring to the community a thought-provoking lecture by a renowned authority, and the topic is one that is not only of historic significance, but increasingly relevant today. John Q. Barrett is a professor of law at St. John's University in New York City, where he teaches constitutional law and legal history. He's also the Elizabeth S. Lenna Fellow and a board member of the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York. Professor Barrett is writing the biography of Robert H. Jackson, U.S. Supreme Court Justice and Nuremberg Chief Prosecutor of the principal Nazi war criminals following World War II. Justice Jackson is recognized as one of the finest writers, lawyers, judges, and leaders, and is one who lived one of the most consequential, relevant, and inspiring lives in modern history. Professor Barrett is a renowned teacher, writer, public commentator, and lecturer in the U.S. and internationally. In November 2016, he spoke at the historic Nuremberg courtroom at the city's program commemorating the 70th anniversary of the start of the Nuremberg trial. Professor Barrett is author of numerous articles and chapters, including the Jackson List periodic emails, which reach over 100,000 readers around the world. He's a graduate of Georgetown University and Harvard Law School and served as a law clerk to U.S. Circuit Judge A. Leon Higginbotham, Jr. And so now, Nuremberg Lessons, what happened then and why it matters now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ava and Madeline and Pamela, and each of you for being here this morning. An incredibly gorgeous day in a region that has lots of alternative places you could be. So I'm deeply flattered, and I know it's not personal. It is the topic, and it is your sense of the ongoing relevance of considering something like this. What makes it possible is the Historical Society, which you support, which has put this together, and which is an example of a vital, ongoing educational treasure in a community and a region and across a much bigger span than we will ever see. Historical societies capture in the present what we can know and learn and ask and gather and invests it in the future. And so the archives, the programs, the videotapes, the footprints of today will be followed by grandchildren and you name it, who we can't name or even really imagine. But they will learn from and study and then take from the past and plug into their presence some of the richest pieces of the legacies that we have to offer. That's what Nuremberg 71 years ago and forward is for us today. That's what the lives of the senior mans are for us today. That's what each of you is today for the future. And so I'm just a small vehicle to be part of discussing something like that. What I have on the screen is a photo, and I will have a number through the course of this talk. This is courtroom 600 in the Palace of Justice, the courthouse in Nuremberg, Germany, in November 1945. We'll come back to this scene and I will orient you, but generally that is the Nuremberg trial courtroom. That is history's courtroom, that is humanity's courtroom. That's the courtroom that Milton Mann visited as an observer working on occupation army educational programming during the course of this trial. It's easy for us to look at Nuremberg as, of course, it looks to us, a historic achievement, an event in the late 1940s, a post-war accountability process. But that's Nuremberg from the back end. And what I want to do, I hope, is reorient you a little bit during this talk to Nuremberg from the front end. I want you to think of Nuremberg not as a done, completed achievement, but Nuremberg as a city where they found a building, where they decided to pursue an endeavor that was novel and perilous and man-made and all the frailties and screw-ups that come with that. And they got it done. Not perfectly by any means. Plenty of bad days and missteps, and hindsight is always a wonderful vantage point. But they put themselves to this task.
And that's the lesson of history. You plug into somebody who put themselves to a task, and the ones that impress us and come to be meaningful over time are the higher tasks, the higher pursuits, the better uses of time, the things that actually got it done as best they could. And that's the story of human endeavor. Now, that's a face of human endeavor. That's Milton Mann. In 2008 is when this oral history video was taken. I didn't have the privilege to meet Mr. Mann or Norma Mann, but I feel well acquainted with them now through the videotape interview, which luckily the Historical Society gathered. It brought me into their home, to the hearth of their fireplace, to the stories, to their chemistry and byplay, and very modest recounting of their lives of substantial contribution. This is another face, and it's the one that I start with as a biographer. That's Justice Robert H. Jackson, who served on the U.S. Supreme Court during the 1940s and 1950s, who lived a short life by our modern standards, 1892 to 1954, only 62 years. What a little modern cardiology could have done didn't exist in his time, unfortunately. And he becomes the chief U.S. prosecutor at the one and only international Nuremberg trial. My path into Nuremberg is as an American lawyer, a former Justice Department prosecutor, a law professor, a constitutional law teacher, a student of the U.S. Supreme Court, and particularly a student, scholar, biographer of Justice Jackson. But once I got started on Jackson, of course, the sort of big centerpiece topic in his life was the 18 months he spent as the chief prosecutor at Nuremberg. So Supreme Court, constitutional law, Jackson, Nuremberg is my path. His path starts here, and I'm going to give you just a very quick tour of his life. This is a beautiful little farm valley in northwest Pennsylvania. It's in Warren County. That's the birthplace of Robert Jackson in 1892, a family farm. His great-grandfather came west from, yes, here's your hook, Connecticut, after his Revolutionary War service, got as far as the Western Reserve, lived in a stockade fort during the Indian Wars, didn't love that, so retreated a little bit to Pennsylvania and picked this valley. And he and a buddy cleared the land and built a log cabin, and generation, 4 generations later, 1801 to 1892, they had this great-grandson. He was born in this farmhouse, and I'm no architect, but I'd say you see a little Connecticut. In that architectural style, that's not the log cabin. That's when a little bit more prosperity allowed them to build up on the banks of this creek, and that's where the boy was born. The father of the future Justice Jackson was not cut out for farming, and maybe there's an American story generally in there too. So when Robert Jackson was a boy, the family moved from Pennsylvania above the state line into New York State to a little village called Frewsburg. It's still basically an intersection with a delicious ice cream stand right at the stop sign. And Jackson's father opened the Jackson Hotel. This is circa 1904. The Jackson Hotel, like every wood frame building in 1904, soon burned to the ground. Robert Jackson went to the Frewsburg High School. That's him at age 17 as the valedictorian. Most of the schooling was in one room that was the high school. And most of the teachers were, kind of well-meaning, but themselves only high school graduates. That works for me. Does that help the crowd? Okay. So that's Jackson at age 17. I focus on this moment because that is the end of his general higher education. He never goes to college for a day in his life. You couldn't get today to the destinations he reached without a college education, of course. But he went up the valley from Frewsburg to the nearby city of Jamestown and took a second senior year of high school, age 17 to 18, and it was basically tutorial teaching from college graduates. Indeed, one had a master's degree, and it was kind of a tutorial program. And then he became a law apprentice. Age 18, 19, went for 1 year to the Albany Law School, returned to be a law apprentice. Age 21, hangs out a shingle and begins law practice in Jamestown, New York. Pretty quickly, he's drawn up the valley to Buffalo, which is the 10th leading city in the country at that time. This is 1915, 16, 17. Booming lake, economy, rail center. And he practices big city law a little bit, but realizes this is a tall ladder and you got to wait your turn, and you're not going to really be a big shot in Buffalo until you're 55 years old. So he retreats to Jamestown, and in short order, his solo practice has 2, 3, 4 juniors. He's involved in bar association activities, local, regional, state, national. By 1933, he's the president of the American Bar Association House of Delegates. He's a nationally prominent oil and gas lawyer because of the Pennsylvania oil fields. He's a regular advocate before the New York Court of Appeals. He is all of 40 years old, and he's got life by the tail. How do you know? He built a big house with white pillars. That's the Jackson House in Jamestown, New York, which still stands. He had an 88-acre horse farm. He was quite a dapper fellow. That's how you dressed for horseback riding, circa 1928. He had a cabin cruiser on Chautauqua Lake. He had a beautiful wife and 2 children, and had fleshed out a little bit. Prosperity is in his face in the early 1930s. You might never have heard of him because his private world and his attainments at the kind of selfish parochial level were fulfilling and filling, and life was great. But Robert Jackson, from youth, always had a second stripe, if you will. Not just the education, professional, prosperity, achievement stripe, but politics, small p, citizenship, connection to the polity. His family was Jeffersonian Democrats, rural agrarians of the northern type. And in western New York State, Democrats weren't so prevalent. So when Jackson was a law apprentice, his mentor was another Democrat who was the county committee man. And he took his boy, Robert Jackson, in 1911 to Albany, across the state on political business, introduced him to lots of people, many handshakes. One of them, entirely forgettable, at least on the non-Jackson side, and barely memorable on the Jackson side, was a freshman state senator from Dutchess County, New York, who was 28 years old, who had been recruited by the Democrats to run for the state senate because he could self-finance, because he was rich, and because he had a heck of a surname. You see, it was by distant relationship, the fifth cousin connection to Colonel Roosevelt, the President of the United States, and by 1910, the year of this race, the former president, now living in Oyster Bay. And so they persuaded this guy, Frank Roosevelt, to run for the state senate. And it snowed on election day, so it depressed the rural vote. Poughkeepsie turned out, and Frank Roosevelt barely got elected to the New York State Senate. You think about history's moments, that snow in November 1910 was extremely important for the history of the world. Because Frank Roosevelt is an insurgent Democrat in January 1911, 28. He meets this law apprentice who's nobody from Jamestown, Robert Jackson, age 18. Life goes on. Jackson rises in the legal profession. Frank Roosevelt rises, of course, in politics and starts to call himself Franklin, becomes the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, becomes the Democratic Party's vice presidential nominee in 1920, gets slaughtered, along with the top of the ticket, Governor James Cox of Ohio, by Harding and Coolidge, and then the next summer contracts polio, and then disappears from the scene for years trying to recover his ability to walk, and then is arm twisted by Al Smith in 1928 to run for governor of New York, because Al Smith is the Democratic nominee and wants a big New York turnout, and he's a Catholic candidate, and a Protestant at the top of the state office ticket might help a little bit. Roosevelt outruns Al Smith, gets elected governor. You know the story from there. So Robert Jackson, the Western New York lawyer, is somewhere in the Rolodex of Franklin Roosevelt in the 1920s. As Roosevelt's returning to the political scene, who does he know across the counties of New York State? Well, he knows this lawyer, Jackson, Democrat, Republican territory. And Jackson becomes a political supporter and a proxy speaker and an advisor to the governor. And in his second 2-year term, the re-elected governor, and then the presidential candidate, and then the president-elect in 1933. By 1933's fall, Jackson is recruited to Washington. He thinks it's a very short-term gig. He's got, of course, the white pillars and the horse farm and life in Jamestown, and he's not looking to be in Washington for very long, but he becomes the general counsel heading the Bureau of Revenue, today the IRS. Huge law office, 200 lawyers, and Jackson's nominated by Roosevelt and confirmed by the Senate to be the general counsel of the Bureau of Revenue. And that's the first of this string of presidential appointments and senatorial confirmations. And just, sort of like swallow because your ears are going to pop. 1933, Revenue. 1935, SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission. 1936, Justice Department. First heading the Tax Division, then 1937 heading the Antitrust Division. 1938, Solicitor General of the United States, arguing the government's cases in the Supreme Court. 1940, Attorney General of the United States. And 18 months later, Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, your resumes may be dazzling, but I think you've just been blown out of the water. And at that point, summer of 1941, Robert Jackson is 49 years old. Up that ladder. This is a glimpse of that relationship. Roosevelt, the nonchalant grip on the post, you'd never know is what he needs to stand up, because otherwise he'd fall over because he's got polio and paralyzed legs. And this is a fishing trip off the coast of Florida. That's Robert Jackson during his SEC years. That's Harold Ickes, the Secretary of Interior. That's the Secretary of Commerce. And Jackson becomes the man for the biggest legal project. Tough case, tough challenge, public controversy, get Jackson. And without meaning to draw any insulting equivalences, because the Nazis are their own unique category, 10 years later, the big case needs the best lawyer is, of course, the same question, get Jackson. This is Jackson on the cover of Newsweek when he's defending in the Supreme Court a major New Deal law, and it's heavy sledding, but he wins its constitutionality. He also wins the Social Security Act's constitutionality, the National Labor Relations Act constitutionality. He is a sterling appellate courtroom advocate in addition to having trial skills. That's Jackson at his desk in the Justice Department as Solicitor General. That's the Supreme Court as Jackson begins to argue before it. It's the Hughes Court, often mistaken for God, but that's Charles Evans Hughes, that's Louis Brandeis, that's Ben Cardozo. These are four justices who hate the New Deal. That's the first Roosevelt appointee, Hugo Black. This is, in other words, the court-packing immediate aftermath year. And so the court is changing, and Jackson is a great advocate before it. This is Jackson at the Attorney General's conference table, the office he's appointed to in 1940. And for the 18 months he's U.S. Attorney General, the principal legal project of the Justice Department is war preparation. The isolationist, uninvolved, but looking and wishing to aid Great Britain, United States, has neutrality laws and surplus property disposition constraints, things that are restrictions in the way of Roosevelt's instinct to carefully try to do what he can to aid Churchill. Jackson's his lawyer to advise him on how to do that. This is Jackson with his successor as Solicitor General, Francis Biddle, so now the number 1 and the number 2 in the Justice Department. And I show you Biddle here in the United States because I'm going to show you Biddle again in a few years at Nuremberg. This is an overage Great War era, subsequently renamed World War I, destroyer. The United States had a lot of these in mothballs in the summer of 1940. And Winston Churchill, Prime Minister in May of 1940, begs Roosevelt, we're alone, France has fallen, we're getting killed by U-boats, give us destroyers. It's one of those war preparatory legal questions. And Attorney General Jackson writes the legal opinion which says you can't just give American naval assets to Great Britain. Roosevelt then refashions the deal, gets from Churchill basing rights to British colonial properties down the Atlantic seaboard, and the net deal is advantageous to the United States. We get great real estate, 99-year basing rights, and they get our 30-year-old semi-leaky destroyers. That's legal. And that legal opinion explains that it doesn't violate neutrality laws because providing this military assistance to Great Britain isn't just jumping into a foreign war. War, you see, had been perceived as equal participation, belligerents engaged in war. And neutrality laws prohibited aiding belligerents. That wasn't what we were looking at in 1940, wrote Jackson. We're looking at a violation of international law, Nazi aggression that makes Great Britain not a co-belligerent of Nazi Germany, but instead, if you will, the victim of a crime by the Nazis who have violated international law. And thus the neutrality laws don't apply. Treaties have changed the law of war to make it no longer a right of nations, and it's legal for us to provide that assistance. When Jackson is writing that opinion in the summer of 1940, and then is put publicly forward by Roosevelt to catch all the flack and criticism, he's not thinking that that theory that the Nazis are criminals has a future or is about anything other than the moment at hand. But in hindsight, looking from the back end as we do, the root of the Nuremberg trial theory is that theory of what the Nazis had done. The international order prohibited certain conduct and they breached it. They became criminals. And that made it legal to give votes to Great Britain in 1940, and that made it legal to hold Nazis accountable in a courtroom beginning in 1945. That's Jackson with the Vice President, John Nance Garner, Roosevelt's first vice president, the first 2 terms outside the White House. And by the end of the second term, Roosevelt was planning to retire to Hyde Park. Garner was from Texas and aged, and not by our standards, but by his view, not particularly looking to run. And the question is, who's next? For the New Dealers, maybe Robert Jackson. It's one of the great what-ifs. If Roosevelt had retired after 2 terms, who knows? Jackson in the end never runs for high office of any type. And Roosevelt, of course, does run for a 3rd term and wins it, and then the 4th term. World events intervene. This is Roosevelt at the podium at a joint session of Congress in May of 1941, asking for, my little caption, over $1 billion, which in 1941 is real money, to build up American air defenses. And arrayed across the front row is the cabinet, the Agriculture Secretary, Henry Wallace, the Commerce Secretary, Harry Hopkins, the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, and the youngest, I think, by hair color at least, the Attorney General of the United States, Robert Jackson. That's the Roosevelt cabinet as this 3rd term and approaching American involvement. We're still 6 months before Pearl Harbor is the political climate. Over here on the left, I think you can make him out. It's an obscure senator, the junior senator from the state of Missouri. I don't know whatever became of the guy. His name was Harry something. In this picture, yeah, he's not a nothing in the Senate, but you'd never think that he was destined to be that person. Jackson shaking Roosevelt's hand in the summer of 1941 as he's appointed to the Supreme Court. His friend and former boss, Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of Treasury, his wife, Irene Jackson, his daughter, Mary Jackson, the Supreme Court clerk holding the Bible on which Jackson had just taken the oath. And that's Jackson in robes, a new role that he began to accommodate himself to, being a jurist, being out of the executive branch and out of politics, writing opinions that quickly became renowned. He's the most gorgeous writer in the history of the Supreme Court. Okay, some might be Oliver Wendell Holmes fans. And I think there's an ongoing contemporary case that John Roberts and Elena Kagan and maybe Justice Scalia in his career all might stake a claim. They were in our great writers, the prose skills. But Jackson, I think, trumps all of them. And his opinions during those 4 years, 1941 to 1945, include some real landmarks. His dissenting opinion in the Japanese-American exclusion case, United States versus Korematsu, is probably very high on his legacy list. His opinion for the court in West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett, the flag salute case, upholding the rights of 2 little Jehovah's Witnesses schoolgirls whose faith said, "Thou shalt not bow down before graven images," to refuse to be compelled by their school to say the Pledge of Allegiance. The power of the Congress of the United States to regulate intra-state commerce events that in aggregation had substantial effects on interstate commerce, Wickard versus Filburn, and many others. Jackson is becoming Justice Jackson. And if Roosevelt had lived long enough, he intended to make him Chief Justice. This is Harlan Stone, who's the Chief Justice. That's Jackson as the rookie justice. This is largely the New Deal court. That was Hugo Black, there he is, who was Roosevelt's first appointee. You can see how he's moved up in seniority. Felix Frankfurter, Stanley Reed, James Burns, William O. Douglas, Frank Murphy, Robert Jackson. This has become the New Deal court, and if history had played out, it probably would have become the Jackson court. But Roosevelt died. Let me shift gears across the ocean to Nazi Germany. This isn't news, but part of the power of the imagery is what I hope you'll kind of feel very directly. This is the Führer Tribune at the Zeppelin Field in Nuremberg, Germany, where every fall, beginning in 1933, the Nazi Party held gatherings that were pep rallies and patriotism festivals and Oktoberfest beer drinking festivals and speech listening and applauding mania festivals as Nazi Germany, under the Führer, recovered its national pride and began to rise again to its rightful place among the great nations, which it had lost following the Great War and Versailles and reparations obligations, etc., etc. These Nuremberg rallies aren't the only thing that starts in 1933. This is Dachau, a former munitions factory south of Nuremberg. Nuremberg is in Bavaria, I'll show you in a map in a minute, north of Munich, which in the spring of 1933 is the first concentration camp that very publicly is created by the Nazi Reich. It's for political enemies of the Reich, people who are going to get in the way of the national greatness. It's not to be a facility for imprisonment of people who have been convicted through the courts. That's so slow and cumbersome. This is a place for people to be preventively detained, rounded up, arrested, incarcerated. Jews, communists, labor leaders, Jehovah's Witnesses, atheists, foreigners of all types end up in Dachau. And in its earliest days, it's certainly nothing of a human rights respecting quality, but it's not a horrible detention facility. It's not overcrowded. It's inspected by the Red Cross. There's sufficient caloric intake to the people who are the inmates. They're not disease-ridden, but they're locked up and they're getting out of the way of the citizens who are raising Nazi Germany to what its argument is it should be. Of course, over time, Dachau and then the other German concentration camps become houses of horror, overcrowding, torture, murder, indeed extermination, in a slide from mere incarceration. I want to draw right here a bright line that everybody should remember and teach between concentration camps in Germany and extermination camps in occupied lands that were conquered by the aggressive military successes of Germany. In the end, the death tolls and the suffering and the accountability properly encompass both, but these were planned to lock up, whereas places like Sobibor and Treblinka and Auschwitz were planned only to exterminate. But of course, that required conquering and capturing and war-making. This is the Führer. That's Hitler in color in Germany, in Nuremberg. We'll see that church again in a minute. That's another view of the Zeppelin Field and the Führer Tribune and the marching troops and the patriotism. That's that church, Frauenkirche, Church of Our Lady, in the square at the heart of Nuremberg, renamed Adolf Hitler Platz. It had been Nuremberger Platz, and today again it is Nuremberger Platz. But that's the heart of the city, that's where that color photo was. And this is another photo, Frauenkirche in the background, Adolf Hitler, Hermann Goering, the Reichsmarshal, the head of the Luftwaffe, his number 2, and after the war, the person who's heading to be the lead defendant at Nuremberg. This is a chart of madness. There's, in the exhibit here, which is wonderful, my congratulations too, a different version of the same information. It's a Nazi chart saying who is a Jew. It's eugenicist theory embodied in 1935 Nuremberg laws pronounced at that rally, which is the Nazi prerogative to declare who is a Jew, from which, of course, flows horrible consequences like property requisitioning and professional occupation stripping and deportation and incarceration in concentration camps and prohibition on intimate relationships and criminality of marriages and so forth. And the gist of it is that, of course, if they think you have 4 Jewish grandparents, you are a Jew. But if they can find 3 Jewish grandparents, you're a Jew. And if there are only 2, then you start down the slope to Mischlings, but these are the Aryans who are real Germans. Citizenship is here. Consequences, human rights violation, punishment, expulsion, suffering, incarceration, and death is the rest of the chart. And now here's the deep perversion of it. Who is a Jew? Well, anyone who says, I'm a Jew, right? That wasn't the Nazi criterion. The Nazi criterion is we say who's a Jew. So if you say, these people are Lutherans or atheists or communists or whatever, but we think they're Jews and you're a Jew. And then the Nuremberg laws attached with all their horrible consequences. This is 1935. The Nazi war-making and conquering, if you will, before it goes into Poland and is on the march across the European continent, conquers Germany. And it's not a small force that conquers an innocent population. This is a passport. A man in Nuremberg who was a dear friend of mine, Arno Hamburger. And you see under the Nuremberg laws that he is a teenager who would have said, I'm a Jew, because he said it his whole life, whose parents said they were Jew, had to carry the pink J stamped on it, which was a deportation signal and a property confiscation signal. Arno made it out miraculously through forged papers to Trieste, to Palestine. He was on an education visa. This is Palestine in 1939, pre-Israel, of course. And he overstays his visa. He's a student who breaks the law and stays, and then joins the British Army, and then comes back and fights, and he's in Holland and so forth, and he lives. And of course, the moment the Nazis surrender, what does he do? He steals a Jeep to get back to Nuremberg to see what became of his parents. And miraculously, they had lived, although they were in very broken health. And Arno Hamburger, this teenager in the 1930s, spends the rest of his life in Nuremberg, more or less. He married a woman who he loved dearly, but she made Aliyah and mostly lived in Israel. And their children mostly lived in Israel. And Arno stayed in Nuremberg and was a member of the city council and was the president of the Jewish community in Nuremberg. And I said to him at one point, Arno, why do you live in Nuremberg? Your family, your loved ones, Israel. He said, because I am a Jew from Nuremberg. My whole life has been about my right to be a Jew from Nuremberg. And that's what, on the front end, the perversion of Nuremberg laws tried to take away. Comes a war. A brutal, horrific war. These are Nazi tanks. They look like little toys compared to modern tanks, but these are deadly weapons rolling into Poland on September 1, 1939. And very quickly, of course, from the west, the Nazis conquer Poland, and their ally, the USSR, conquers from the east. This is a famous photo of an angelic boy in Warsaw, and nothing more is known about him. This is in an album that a Nazi officer, Stroop, compiled. It's sort of the satanic flip version of Milton Mann's war service album. Stroop's photo album was a celebratory photographic record of the conquering of Poland. And this is in the album. This is a memento. This is part of what we Nazis accomplished, is the mindset. This war was up for grabs. From the back end, we think of World War II and the Greatest Generation, and thank goodness we got in and we were going to win, and we did win, and that wasn't clear. That was very unclear. Of course, in the 1930s, getting 50 overage destroyers to Great Britain is a legal needle that's hard to thread. Forget about, substantial munitions. But even after December of 1941, when miraculously and with lunacy, Adolf Hitler declares war on the United States, because otherwise we would have fought the Japanese, right? They'd attacked Pearl Harbor. Our war would have been entirely a Pacific war. But Hitler declares war on the United States. We reciprocate. And eventually through North Africa, and then Sicily and Italy and Normandy, and the general story, the American economic and military and productive and soldiering might, aiding the Allies, and Hitler, foolishly, with lunacy, breaching his treaty with the USSR and moving them from ally to the enemy camp, and then suffering what they were able to do from the East, is losing the war. This is November of 1943. It's a conference table in Moscow. That's Molotov, the foreign minister. That's Anthony Eden, the British foreign secretary. That's the American Secretary of State, Cordell Hull. They are meeting because this alliance can now plan for how the world will work after we win. November of 1943 is, of course, not close to the end, and there's a ton of bloody fighting again. But the Moscow Declaration is the beginning of the planning of the post-war world order. And one of the topics pretty far down the list in the Moscow Declaration that these foreign ministers issue in the names of their principals, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, is a commitment that we together will hold the Nazi criminals who did this to the world accountable. It doesn't quite use the word trial. It doesn't have any details, but the idea of international accountability is embodied in this Moscow Declaration. It's repeated, now we're up at the top level, at Yalta in February of 1945, where the big three have their final meeting, it turns out. And the Yalta Declaration, of course, covers many topics, but reiterates the Moscow Declaration of 14 months earlier and spells out a little bit more about how this international accountability will be achieved. And then Roosevelt dies. You actually see it on his face here in February. He's dead less than 2 months later. And that senator from Missouri, who had been vice president of the United States for 6 weeks, inherits this desk, gets to fill up an ashtray, verboten by the time of the Obama administration, of course, and I don't think President Trump is a smoker either, and all the enormous challenges that come with this. You know, top of the list, surprise briefings. We've got people in Los Alamos doing research on a weapon that might work, that might be usable, that might change the war and prevent the need to send land forces into Japan. But pretty high on the list is we've got a commitment to prosecute the Nazis with our allies. Moscow, Yalta, now you, Harry Truman, inherit this commitment. And so what Truman does is what Roosevelt had been doing for the past decade. He reaches out for the best legal figure in the country. Now, of course, Robert Jackson by this time is a U.S. Supreme Court justice. To our ears, it's kind of shocking. U.S. Supreme Court justice being recruited by the president to do an executive branch job. We wouldn't, separation of powers is stricter today. But it wasn't unprecedented to reach out to the Supreme Court. And this moment of April 1945 fits with the Supreme Court calendar. The court takes a summer recess, as you know. Robert Jackson, the beautiful writer, was very autonomous and fast and had basically written his opinions for the term that was about to end in 1945. And Truman says, we've got this promise. We need a great lawyer to lead it. All the work has been done. Moscow, Yalta, the army that is conquering and converging on Berlin is gathering all kinds of evidence. We're about to capture the defendants. In a boiled down way, the question is, will you prosecute Adolf Hitler this summer? When your country asks, you should say yes. When you're a lawyer and you're offered an opportunity like that, it's a very attractive thing, especially if you're told it's a turnkey operation. It's all ready to go and you have a summer recess coming up. The reason to get Jackson to do it was so that Great Britain and the USSR and the new reestablished French Republic as the sort of weakest of the quartet would comparably staff their participation in this. We'll give our best legal figure and that will inspire them to do likewise. So Jackson says yes. No sooner is this publicly unveiled, May 2, 1945, than you can sort of see that metaphorically the ashtray should be on this desk. The war is about to be won, but guess who's dead? Hitler, Goebbels, Himmler, probably maybe Bormann, although they try him in absentia at Nuremberg because they're not quite sure. So the kind of inner circle is really Hermann Goering and, okay, crazy Rudolf Hess, who's been in the Tower of London for the whole war, Ribbentrop, a few others. But, prosecute Hitler? No. All worked out, Moscow, Yalta? Not when you look at it. These are superficial rhetorical commitments. No plan about how to actually do it. No court, no legal system. What about all the assembled evidence? Nope. So Jackson embarks on this task. This is the German surrender 6 days later at Reims, with a summer of diplomacy. It's important to recognize that in the summer of 1945, there is no Germany. That surrender at Reims is unconditional surrender, the relinquishment of sovereignty. What replaces it is Allied occupation, and it's basically quartets. The adjacent areas are occupied by the Allied powers. So the pink area is the Russian zone, the yellow area is the British zone, the red, white, and blue stripes are the French zone, and the United States, not being from the neighborhood, is the blue zone. This is occupied Austria, which is a version of the same quadripartite division. Jackson goes to London in the summer of 1945 to negotiate with his Allied counterparts how to do this. This is a building called Church House at Westminster Abbey. It's part of the Church of England properties and complex. And there, literally, around a four-sided table, the principals from these four nations negotiate. How will we do this? This is the American side of the table. There's Jackson in a bow tie, his deputy, Wild Bill Donovan, the head of the OSS. Jackson's own son, Bill Jackson, as his father's executive assistant, a young lawyer and a brilliant lawyer across a long career, a War Department lawyer named Murray Bernays. This is the British side of the table, and largely those two were in sync. This is the French side of the table. Largely they were a starving, thinly staffed trailer on this engine. But they have a civil law system that is not exactly the Anglo-American common law system. Their backs to the camera are the representatives of the USSR. And they have an entirely different worldview. Yes, we will do this together, they say, because we have agreed from Moscow through Yalta to today that we will punish these criminals together. Yes, of course we should have a trial. We should display them before we hang them. That's how we do things. Kharkov and Moscow and, what we call show trials, that is the Soviet way. So let's go to it. And the Americans and British say, wait a second, that's not what we mean by trial. What we mean is due process of law. We mean a fair prospect of acquittal. If it's rigged in advance, it's not a trial system by our standards. And Jackson pointedly says, that is not what I will be a part of. I'm a lawman, I'm a jurist now, I've been a lawyer across my career. The executive branch can use force. The executive forces of the military can line people up and shoot them. And if they want to dress it up with some kind of military drumhead court first, fine, that's power. But that's not law. And what I'm here for is law. And of course, this is a fundamental impasse. And it goes around and around and around for weeks in Church House during the summer of 1945. It looks like the Cold War is going to begin at this table, that the alliance that won the war is going to fracture. And probably what would have happened is that these three nations, US, Great Britain, France, would have together done something, and the Russians separately would have done something. So during the summer of 1945, while negotiating during the weeks, they actually begin on the side to prepare for that kind of fracture. And this is the first trip to Nuremberg, July of 1945. Justice Jackson, his British counterpart, his French counterpart, and various staff go to Nuremberg. Why Nuremberg? It was in the American sector, and the US Army was recommending it as a trial site. Remember Frauenkirche? This is what it looked like in July of 1945. Nuremberg had been bombed to smithereens by the Allies. Okay, by this point it's been swept up a little bit, but how could you do a trial in Nuremberg, which had been largely flattened? Well, because outside of Nuremberg, at least outside of the old city, the Altstadt, down the perimeter road connecting to the next adjacent town, Fürth, the Fürther Strasse, was this complex, the Palace of Justice. a large courthouse complex. Okay, this was hit by a bomb, that's a missing space. And an adjacent building, which is more courtrooms, we'll come back to those windows. And behind it, a largely intact wheel and spoke prison complex. This is a facility in, by occupation terms, the United States, the American sector. Security, provisions, control, army of occupation, which is nearly 1 million men, and one of whom is Milton Mann. So they look at this facility. There you see some of the roof damage. They look at this courtroom. There are the 4 windows of courtroom 600. This is a little bit later. You see the roof repairs. It had been hit by flak and stray bombs, but not obliterated. You can see the occupation army, parking lot patrols, etc. in front of the courthouse. This is what courtroom 600 looked like when they first inspected it. It was being used kind of as an R&R social club by the occupation army. I wouldn't have got this except a now departed friend in his 90s said, "See the fuel cans?" And I said, "Yeah, I never noticed that." He said, "Oops. Remember, we're 2 flights up? What are fuel cans doing up on the 3rd floor by American standards or the 2nd floor by European standards?" I said, "I give up." He said, "The best way to carry the largest quantity of libations upstairs that we had available." "Okay," he said, "it left a kind of aftertaste." So this was their drinking club. But it, with a little bit of fixing up, could be a courtroom. That's the Potsdam Conference in the same summer, same month, July of 1945. Stalin must have been kind of looking around for Churchill and Roosevelt going, what's going on, right? Because Harry Truman, who's he, and Clement Attlee, who had won this election and sort of subs in for Churchill in July of 1945, this is the new big 3. And Robert Jackson, in addition to inspecting Nuremberg with his Western colleagues, if you will, comes to Potsdam and says to Truman and team, "What am I supposed to do? I'm at this impasse with the USSR." And Harry Truman says, "Do what you think is right." And that's about all he says. Which, as instructions from the president, is huge and scary and non-specific, right? Here are the keys to the car. Feel free to drive it left or right or off the cliff. Do what you think is right. So Jackson goes back to London with that kind of authorization and plays hardball with the Soviets. Very important is that most of the prospective defendants are in American custody. So if the Soviets are going to go their own way, who are their premier Klieg-Light defendants? Goering, Hess, Ribbentrop, etc. Those are in American and British custody. That, in addition, I think Stalin and Moscow just directing the London team to go with it, leads to this agreement, signed on August 8, 1945. It's the London Agreement creating the world's first international criminal court, the International Military Tribunal of Nuremberg. It's called military not because it's a court-martial, but because there is no Germany and the land is under military occupation. It provides that each nation will appoint a judge and an alternate. In the end, no judge became ill, so no alternate had to step up, and they functioned as a court of 8. It said this tribunal will have jurisdiction over 4 crimes: conspiracy or planning, waging aggressive war, committing war crimes, battlefield crimes if you will, and committing crimes against humanity, occupation, civilian oppression crimes. It will do this in public proceedings based on an indictment filed by the prosecution spelling out the particulars of a charge against any individual. That individual will have the right to counsel of choice, funded by the allies who are holding that person accountable. The tribunal will use rules of evidence that are permissive, non-technical, and permit relevant information to be brought forward. The defense attorneys will have the right to discovery of evidence. They get documents. They will have the right to compulsory process. They get witnesses. And the tribunal will hold the prosecution for whom it does not work. Got that? The judges don't work for the prosecutors. separate functions. The tribunal will hold the prosecutors for whom they do not work to a burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. What that generally describes is what you will find on Monday morning in any courthouse in Connecticut. It more or less is American constitutional due process in a Bill of Rights system. And that heavy-handed American imposition model is what Jackson decides is right and is able to persuade the Russians to sign on to. By October, each nation appoints its judges, and this is their ceremonial first meeting in Berlin in the Soviet sector, which was a little bit of a face-saving concession to the Soviets, which wanted the whole proceeding to occur in their sector. No, we'll do the first trial in Nuremberg, but the tribunal will have its first meeting in Berlin. And that's Francis Biddle, the Solicitor General under Jackson in the Justice Department, who succeeds him as Attorney General, and then is replaced by Truman, but then appointed by Truman to be the judge, the American judge on the tribunal at Nuremberg. This is a diagram of the courtroom. It was handed out by press officers to every visitor. And this is the one that Milton Mann brought home. He was young enough to be drafted late enough not to be North Africa, not to be Sicily, not to be Italy. Instead, to be in basic training and language training and taught Japanese to be prepared to work as a translator in the invasion army in the Pacific. And the atomic bomb prevented that horrific endeavor, leaving aside and not judging the comparative horrors of the atomic bomb, and made him an occupation soldier in Germany, or the former Germany. And as he said in the oral history, he was working in education, which was cycling people through this public trial so they could see and then explain back both to their colleagues as soldiers and to the Germans in the region where they were an occupation army what Nuremberg was learning and doing and what the rule of law was about. The chart is a reverse of this photo. So bear with me. This is the top of the courtroom. And this is the witness stand. This is the interpreter's box. These are seats in the defendant's box. These are tables for defense attorneys. These are tables for judicial assistants, and this is the bench for the judges. Not very far away is the podium from which a person questions the witness, and then the prosecution tables. French, USSR, US, British, and overflow. And then this was a public gallery for the press, and in a balcony above it are the seats for visitors, and I assume that's where Mr. Mann sat when he was a visitor. Now, flipping it over, this is a photo of the same thing. It's in the air, if you will, above the witness box and above the interpreters. These are the judicial assistants. This is the judges. These are the defense attorneys, many of whom were hardcore Nazis. I get to have the lawyer I want this one, said various defendants. And the occupation armies found these guys, brought them to Nuremberg, gave them houses, gave them stipends, gave them staff, and let them do their defense work. These are the defendants, and now French, USSR, US, British, overflow, public, and visitors. And that's Milton Mann. No, I wish. But imagine that that's Milton Mann. These are the judges. Bald heads were popular at that time, so this is Francis Biddle's. This is the presiding judge, Geoffrey Lawrence of the UK. This is the French judge. This is the Russian judge. Only they wore uniforms, which shows you that the mindset, even though they'd signed on for the Anglo-American model, if you will, still was more of a force model than a civilian rule of law model to the Soviets. These are the defendants in this one and only international trial: Hermann Goering, Rudolf Hess, Joachim von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister, the three people itemized in that Milton Mann letter that Madeline read. And they were largely the defendants, the representatives, the surviving representatives of the sectors of Nazism. So this was Hitler's number 2, this was Hitler's number 3, this is the foreign minister, this is Wilhelm Keitel, the head of the Wehrmacht, this is Albert Speer, the minister of war production, this is various other people, this is Julius Streicher, the propagandist, this is Walter Funk, the head of the Reichsbank, whose vaults contained an enormous number of gold fillings, which had been pulled from the corpses, which had been exterminated in the camps in occupied Poland. The Nuremberg trial begins in November of 1945. As a non-turnkey operation goes, that's an amazingly fast accomplishment. Surrender in May, all that I've described, and trial starting on November 20th. And this is Jackson looking suitably haggard in this trial process. Across, and this is early 1946, is his executive trial counsel, Thomas J. Dodd of Connecticut, who later became your United States Senator in the 1950s through the 1960s, and his son Christopher Dodd was your senator for, I think, 6 subsequent terms. And various members of the American team. That's Jackson's son Bill. This is John Harlan Amon, who was a mob prosecutor from Brooklyn. He went from Murder Inc. to Nazi Inc., if you will. And a very talented staff. The decision that Jackson makes is to try this case on the Nazi documents. Because once the gathering and analysis had gone forward, they found that on paper, authentic, unimpeachable, not anybody's recollection or anybody cutting a deal, was largely proof of these crimes. The planning and conspiracy, the waging of aggressive war, the commission of war crimes, and the human rights, crimes against humanity, extermination, by our word, Holocaust crimes. This is Jackson at the podium. His opening statement on November 21, 1945 is generally regarded as the finest courtroom speech, at least in the English language. I'd add other languages, although I don't speak them, and I'd take out courtroom. It's just a brilliant, high explanation of what the evidence will show. And among other things, he says in this opening statement, the evidence will show that the Nazis exterminated nearly 6 million Jews. And then over the course of the trial, that's one of the things they prove. This is a color photo, and I just like it because color film was rare, and because you get to see the lights. You see the headphones, Tom Dodd, Robert Jackson, Jackson's secretary, Sam Harris, later of Fried Frank Harris, Schreiber and Jacobson, a Manhattan law firm, British lawyer. Everyone in the courtroom was part of a 4-language proceeding. And the interpreters in the box were pairs of language specialists. The one who could do English-Russian, the one who could do French-German, the one who could do English-German, etc. And they were on 45-minute shifts. And everyone in the courtroom could set the dial to turn their headphone, it was basically a telephone, to the language they understood. So live proceedings, English, German, French, Russian. And the lights were controlled by the interpreters. They, in the interpretation box, could hit the panic button and say, slow down, or stop, I'm hopelessly behind. But it didn't go to the podium, it went to the judge. And the judge would decide if he would activate the podium and make the person stop. When you listen to audio or see film of the Nuremberg trials, notice the pace. I talk medium fast. Cross-examination in a courtroom works best when it can go medium fast, when you can kind of keep throwing punches. The language interpretation of the Nuremberg trial required a lot of slowing down. I want to finish in a minute or two, but I want to focus on this witness, because this is something about the Nuremberg trials that from the front end stunned and surprised them and was a part of their great accomplishment. From the back end, we think was there all the time. This is Rudolf Höss, H-O-E-S-S, not to be confused with the defendant, Rudolf Hess. Rudolf Höss had been the commandant of Auschwitz. He had worked for Himmler, under Himmler's direction, and worked under the Fuhrer. And his assignment, as a person who had a career in corrections, was to go to Poland and build a highly efficient extermination facility. And from 1942 to 1944, that's what he did. And in 1945, as the Russian troops were advancing, the Germans blew up Auschwitz and tried to flee, and Rudolf Höss melted into fugitivity. So the Nuremberg trial starts. Rudolf Höss is not a defendant. Rudolf Höss is a masquerading pig farmer in eastern Germany. But the British catch him. They kind of torture his wife to find out his location, actually. But they find his location. And then they notify the defense attorneys at Nuremberg Now in British custody, former commandant of Auschwitz, Rudolf Höss. So, kind of playing fair and giving access to witnesses. This is an amazing moment, and it gets better. One of the defense attorneys says, bring him to Nuremberg, I want to interview him. It was the defense attorney for Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the head of the SS. And what he wanted Rudolf Höss to say, which he in the end did testify, was that he never saw Kaltenbrunner in Auschwitz. That's a fact, and it's useful for the defense. It distinguishes this defendant from the evidence of Auschwitz. But the evidence of Auschwitz was not really very significant, except by bringing Rudolf Höss to Nuremberg, the prosecutors got to interview him too. And Höss, in his interviews and then on the stand under cross-examination, gives a bureaucratic report of how well he did his job. No apologies, no remorse. He says, this was my assignment and I did it. I succeeded, not perfectly, but I did succeed in exterminating over 2 million Jews. Some of it was disease, much of it was crematoria. He gave a clinical description of the Auschwitz operation, the Holocaust heart of knowledge that we all have. Now here's a sick thing. He padded his numbers because modern Holocaust historiography says Auschwitz actually exterminated only 1.2 million, 1.3 million. So Höss actually didn't quite do his job as well as he was trying to report as a prisoner. But that evidence comes into the trial. That evidence comes before the public. That evidence becomes part of the Nuremberg record. And of course, that evidence is ours for history. In the short term, he's then turned over to the Poles, and he's prosecuted and convicted in Auschwitz in a military tribunal and hung there in Auschwitz in 1947. But his testimony is part of discovering the Holocaust. And that's what doing Nuremberg as a matter of proof, rather than a drumhead court or a firing squad, accomplished. This is Telford Taylor, one of Jackson's principal assistants in the international trial. I focus on him, and this is him with Jackson, because there was only one international trial. By the fall of 1946, Cold War pressures caused both the Americans and the British to say, we don't want to keep doing this with the Russians. We will keep doing trials in Nuremberg in the American sector, but they will be American-only trials. And Jackson returns to the Supreme Court, so Telford Taylor is the chief prosecutor for that phase of subsequent proceedings. And during 1946 through 1949, there are 12 subsequent American-only trials. And they are sort of second-level sector accountability trials. The one you know best, because it's portrayed in the film Judgment at Nuremberg, is the prosecution of the Nazi lawyers and judges. That's one of the Taylor trials, one of the subsequent proceedings. There are cases against the industrialists, Krupp, Farben, that used slave labor. There's the case against the Einsatzgruppen, which were murder teams following invasion forces in the East before they devised extermination camps. Those 12 trials add to the Nuremberg record and largely follow the London Agreement, due process, public proceeding, evidentiary model of the international trial. That's Jackson back in the Supreme Court, looking a little happy to be here. This is Jackson in the last year of his life. It's now the Warren Court. This is the court that decides Brown versus Board of Education. He came back to civilian life and lived 8 more years and did some big things. And he said, by far, the one and only most significant thing I did in my life was the chance to work on the Nuremberg trial. It produced books, transcripts, words on paper, 42 volumes of trial transcripts, plus 12 volumes of exhibits, plus 10 ancillary volumes, translated into every language on the earth, that are the record of what the Nazis did. We are students of that record. A show trial would not have given us these records. A firing squad would not have given us these records. This is a map from a German museum of the concentration camps in blue, the Greater Reich, and the extermination camps in the lighter blue area, that is the Nazi perpetration of what we think of as the Holocaust. Notice 3 things about that. The enormity of it, the comprehensive knowledge of it, which Nuremberg makes possible, and the German teaching of it, which is also part of the Nuremberg legacy. This is Milton Mann, one of our benefactors, at the former Zeppelin field, which you saw in my early slides, where the Nuremberg rallies were held in 1935. This is him in 45, 46. The American Army was now using it as their base. They had renamed it Soldier Field. They had blown up, you see the kind of shards up there, the large swastika that had been on top of the Führer Tribune. Right there is where Adolf Hitler stood and reviewed the troops and the citizens, and the madness poured forth from his voice. And that was what he was there to see and teach and go forward to help the world learn. Nuremberg as a trial is just a human endeavor, from Jackson and Dodd and all the people who did it, to Milton Mann and all the people down to us who have learned from it. And it includes Germany. That's the Palace of Justice today. Yeah, they fixed the roof. That's the Annex building at courtroom 600 today. And in the area under the eaves is an incredibly impressive Memoriam Nuremberg Trials teaching and educational facility, which tells the story of the 13 trials. About 2 kilometers away at the former Nazi Party rally grounds near the Zeppelin field is a documentation center, a major national museum on the order of our U.S. Holocaust Museum, which tells the story of National Socialism and its wars and its crimes. The modern Germany, if I may, among the leaders of the free world that we have today, is something that was made possible by, of course, the Allies winning the war, and then the rule of law, democracy, constitutional law norms that the Nuremberg trials brought to Germany. That's one other successor. That's today's International Criminal Court. A teenager, created in 2002 in The Hague, a creation of well over 100 nations, but not the biggest, most powerful nations in the world. The non-parties include the US, the Russian Federation, China, Israel. So it's not the world's criminal court, but a lot of the world is trying to continue a rule of law legacy through accountability processes, with all the complexities and hard questions and risks that are involved in that, which is a version, if I may, of what they had at Nuremberg. And they got it done. Thank you very much. I apologize for eating some of the Q&A time, but I'm here and would be happy to field some questions, but I did go a little long. Are there some questions, sir?
With respect to the Nuremberg trials, significant efforts to depoliticize them and bring in the rule of law and constitutional due process as defined. In the ICJ,
The ICC. Yeah, the question is about politicization in international courts, which are the concerns that have led the U.S. and other countries not to join the ICC. And those are real concerns. My general argument, my general perspective is that they're, on the track record thus far, exaggerated, that there are a lot of sound, good judgment, highly experienced people involved in that institution, and that the chances of it misfiring are greater if the good forces opt out. We're better off shaping it and contributing to it, as we have done more and more of since President Bush's second term. Since about 2005 forward, up through the end of President Obama's second term, the United States, although not a party to the ICC, is very much involved in consultation, assistance, staffing, advising. And I think that makes the chances better of a better ICC. If and when it misfires, if it indicts the entire American government or an innocent American soldier, pick a nightmare scenario, then we are the United States with all of our power and the chance to sort of fight back by opting out, by criticizing, by defunding, whatever will be a chance we can use then. So I think we're better off in the game than on the sideline. You look for yes, yeah. Yes. I'm trying to go boy, girl.
So on the one hand, we had Justice Jackson at Nuremberg trying to create the system of justice and doing, a very good job of it. But I was really interested to see while Bill Donovan, with him in London, because on the other hand, we had people like Alan Dulles creating rat lines to help high-ranking Nazis escape because he felt that the Soviets were the greater enemy. And I was just wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I said something at the beginning about sainthood. There are a lot of people who aren't saints, and there's an enormous amount of complexity and bad behavior and so forth. The rat line that got Nazis out of Europe and into South America and so forth involved lots of people who, of course, deserve criticism. Not quite sure I blame Alan Dulles, although his fingerprints are on some aspects of it. But as an OSS official in Switzerland, he also did a tremendous amount to facilitate an early German surrender in Italy, and did a tremendous amount of evidentiary assistance to the Nuremberg trial process. So everybody's a mixed scorecard. But the Cold War became an imperative that eclipsed Nuremberg. At a certain point, the directive from the US government to Telford Taylor was stop talking about Germany in a derogatory way, because a West Germany as our ally, a bulwark against the communists, the USSR, is in the birthing. And stop talking about this joint project, the alliance winning the war, the international trial with the USSR. They're now the bad guys. And the Cold War is sort of the way sand buries monuments in the desert. You lose the pyramids. The Cold War caused us to lose Nuremberg for 50 years. And that was a political judgment by a lot of people. Okay. Yes, sir. Blue jacket.
The fourth point of the indictment crimes against humanity was the term genocide that was used at that time.
Yeah. The question is about crimes against humanity and the term genocide. Genocide was a word coined by Raphael Lemkin, Polish lawyer, refugee, lost his whole family in the Holocaust. And he was on the margins of the London Conference and the Nuremberg trial, and campaigning hard for this word, ideology, race, ethnic, religion, targeting of groups, that genocide, homicide, killing of a man, genocide, killing of a genus, captured. And of course, it's a brilliant and effective word. He eventually persuaded the Americans to put it in the Nuremberg indictment. It was added at such a late hour that it's actually in count 3, war crimes, rather than count 4, which is where conceptually, crimes against humanity, we think it fits better. And the Americans did that despite the British really objecting to adding this word. And why did they object so much? Because it's not, as of 1945, in the Oxford English Dictionary. And the Americans basically said, you can take your dictionary. So the word is there in the indictment. The word is not there in the judgment. So the tribunal, I ran out of time and didn't describe all aspects of the judgment, convicts many, not all of the defendants, doesn't use the word genocide. Raphael Lemkin is distraught and goes from Nuremberg back to the United States to begin campaigning at the United Nations, which at that point is on Long Island and Lake Success, and then kind of drifting around Flushing Meadows, and buttonholing people to get them to introduce the Genocide Convention. And so ironically, maybe the frustration of Nuremberg is the motivation for the genocide word becoming bigger and ultimately having its own convention and being a very important font of modern international law. Man. Yes, perfect. Blonde hair, glasses.
With the possible impact that it might have on impartiality, were there any Jews involved in the Nuremberg trials in official status?
Yes. Raphael Lemkin as a consultant is one, but on the Jackson team, quite a few. Sidney Alderman, Bernie Meltzer, Ben Kaplan, Sidney Kaplan, Harriet Zetterberg, a lot. Now, let's not skip over gender. No woman spoke from the podium in the international trial. Some very important women were members of the senior team, but they kind of stayed in the back room, if you will. Jackson was concerned to strike a right balance because early on he got a lot of criticism that this was a Jewish project. And so he, I think, found a balance to not pay any attention to that, but to somewhat rebuff arguments that there should be a crime category charged separately, crimes against the Jews. So crimes against humanity and war crimes include specifications of different groups, and 5.7 million Jews and the would-be extermination is specified. There's no sort of de-Judaizing the Nuremberg indictment, but there's also not count 5 and bad stuff happened to the Jews. He did it with a lot of Jewish lawyers. Indeed, Julius Streicher, I hate to quote him, but this is kind of tongue-in-cheek, told the prison psychiatrist, look at him at the podium. He says his name is Jackson. I know better than that. Jacobson, he's a Jew. I think Jackson, if he'd heard of that, would have taken it as a very high compliment. Yes, sir.
About the term of genocide. Lankan managed to introduce that in the United Nations Genocide Convention. But from what I understand, the Russians kept it out because they don't want the Soviet massacres to be qualified as genocide. So that now the ICC, you know, I deal with the genocide of Cambodia, but we cannot call it genocide because of this exclusion of a group or of ideology.
Okay, so racial, ethnic, religion, but not ideological. Yeah. I mean, the scope of genocide is an ongoing argument. And group targeting versus individual targeting is also an ongoing argument. Which is the bigger evil, or what kinds of definitions and jurisdiction best capture that spectrum of evil? And targeting ideology aimed at a group defined by its ideology in the eyes of the perpetrator does seem to share the evil of targeting a religion or a race. But yes, the Soviets in the Genocide Convention process fought to keep ideology out of the definition.
Well, there was another trial of the Nazis in 1967, I believe, when many of the survivors took part in the trial.
Do you mean Eichmann in Jerusalem?
No,
Okay.
in Germany.
Oh, in Germany. Okay.
There was another trial.
Sure, there were quite a few. Yes.
Yes. However,
Not a lot. Some.
no, unfortunately not a lot. However, in between that time, the American government was importing Nazis into this country and even gave them artificial biographies, and however, the government did not allow the Jews in, but they allowed the Nazis in because they wouldn't be communists.
I don't disagree. It is a piece of the complexity, and it picks up on the earlier question. Yes, the Cold War in all of those dimensions became the defining priority, and it affected a lot of policy decisions that I find regrettable, as you do too. Yes, sir, straight back. Yes.
What extent?
Oh, I'm sorry.
1 moment, Lester.
To what extent has a legal or ethical standard been developed or is developed that a national leader who has the ability to prevent genocide has a duty to do it? Now, I'm giving you one example, Bill Clinton in Rwanda, which I think everyone would agree was a genocide. And at least from the movies, it sure as hell looks like it could have been prevented.
International law now has a developing norm called the responsibility to protect, which is embodied in a resolution that many nations committed to early this century, so after Rwanda. And after Kosovo, which is also under President Clinton and was a use of force and is legally complicated, but was a rescue measure. The idea of a responsibility to protect is an international law duty to use force in situations like that. That's not yet embodied in anything that the United States is committed to. It's not embodied in anything that is a convention that is duty creating, and thus it's certainly not anything that would be a basis for liability if somebody didn't live up to it. But it's very much an active topic of debate and consideration. Of course, it's risky. Part of the United Nations commitment is to prevent national war making through law norms and collective defense. And if you create exceptions to that authorize war making because power identifies a situation that triggers its duty to protect, perhaps you're unleashing a lot of war making that others might question. So it's a work in progress, and I think very complicated.
How many people were charged at the tribunals, and how many were ultimately convicted?
Great question. At the international trial, there were 24 defendants indicted. By the time the trial started, it was down to 21. One had committed suicide, one had been found incompetent, and one was Martin Bormann being tried in absentia. So there were 21 people in the seats, if you will. And of those 21, 18 were convicted and 3 were acquitted. And of the 18 who were convicted, 11 were sentenced to death, and 1 was sentenced to life, and the others were sentenced to terms of years, from 20 down to 5. In the subsequent proceedings, the Telford-Taylor 12 American trials, a total of under 300 additional people were prosecuted. So all told, we're barely at 300. Now they're leaders, they're senior policymakers, perpetrators, decision makers, but it's fair to say that this was a symbolic sample.
And most of the 300 were also
Most, but nothing approaching 90%, more around 70%.
Right, just 2 more questions because we have to vacate the auditorium, the sanctuary. You choose.
Oh, that's eeny, meeny, sir.
First, thank you, Professor Barrett, for coming here this afternoon and your reaction. How accurate was the movie of the trial of Nuremberg with the real thing?
The Judgment in Nuremberg movie is very accurate, at least as to the courtroom proceedings. It has, some Hollywood stuff like the quasi-almost romance between Judge Spencer Tracy and the widow of the German general who had already been executed. I can't vouch for that. I doubt it happened. But the in-courtroom description of the charges, the evidence, the particulars, all very true to the record of that case. The case was called United States versus Allstetter. He was the lead defendant. And for example, the alleged improper Nuremberg law violating relationship between the older Jewish man and the younger Aryan girl played by Judy Garland is totally true to the record of a case against the leader of the Nuremberg Jewish community, Leo Katzenberger, who was tried in one of these hanging courts, the people's courts of the Nazis. She was effectively a niece, a good friend of a daughter of a good friend of his and a tenant, and living in the apartment entirely, innocent, G-rated, lovely relationship, and the Nazis beheaded Leo Katzenberger in that trial. So, very true to the record.
Last one?
Last one, I hate to, there's no win, please pick.
The professor will be here afterwards,
Yeah, I
so we
will
can
hang
ask
around.
questions, but we're going to ask one more for the...
Okay, sir, in the reddish shirt, yes. I apologize to everybody else.
What were the arguments for jurisdiction of the Allied parties over Germany? And how does that analogize for situations today for the issue that we have in the Middle East?
The argument for jurisdiction that was used at Nuremberg was an argument of universal jurisdiction. That although the court did not predate the Nazis and their crimes. The laws embodied in treaty commitments that Germany had made not to wage war, embodied in domestic criminal law that prohibited murder and torture and so forth in Germany, embodied in morals and religions and cultures across the world, made this a crime by anyone everywhere. And Robert Jackson was very clear in his opening statement to say, although the defendants in this dock are Nazi perpetrators charged with these crimes, these are universal standards that apply to we allied nations that apply around the world. And so that is a potentially extremely inspiring concept and a potentially very dangerous concept. Because universal jurisdiction to identify somebody over there violating a norm empowers everybody or anybody in a legal system to go after them. Now, of course, it helps to have power. It's necessary to have power. The moment of 1945 is this great alignment where there had been a world war and basically one side had won. You know, who is the power? The world. So, you know, they could have done everything, anything. And they did these noble things: the Nuremberg trial, the creation of the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Genocide Convention. In that sort of brief, shining few-year period of the late 1940s, we had global consensus of a type that maybe we glimpsed briefly at the end of the Cold War when the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union fell. But even that wasn't fully what 1945 was, and of course, generally, we haven't seen that. So, a renegade legal system in a far-off place cannot capture Donald Trump or Barack Obama or whomever and put him in the dock. They don't have the power. The world order generally has sound, law-bound, powerful consensus that takes these universal norms and uses them in areas of greatest consensus. Unfortunately, today we don't have very many areas of greatest consensus. Syria, for instance, most people could look at and say is aggressive internal war making and, you know, genocidal behavior and so forth, but that's not a consensus. And the USSR, the Russian Federation, that was terrible, I apologize. The Russian Federation, as diplomatic and military support for Syria and veto power in the Security Council of the United Nations, prevents international power, legal power, military power, you name it, from addressing Syria. So, universal jurisdiction in a world of disagreement and a fair amount of weakness is, I think, where we are right now. A last commercial. The email list that Ava mentioned at the beginning, you can just Google Jackson List and get to the archive site. And if you wish to be on it, jot down your email. It's a couple of emails a month. It's a closed list. Your addresses don't go anyplace. I'd be happy to put you on it. And it's a sort of rotating circuit, sometimes Nuremberg International, sometimes Supreme Court American, of Jackson things, if you will. It has been a great pleasure. It's an honor.